All right, so I did the question 24 for you, so of the 2018 paper, and went through it. Quite a long video, but I felt it was necessary to explain the approaches of how to answer the question, to also understand the question, but also get a perspective of what the HSC markers think in terms of when they see your responses and how they actually mark them. So today I'm doing the question 23 of the 2019 paper because that's the one that I marked. I'm going to do that one first, and then I'm going to go through the entire paper so that we get through some of the theory and some of the requirements that they actually do. So here we go. Let's get the HSC paper up, the 2019, and have a look. I went a bit silly there, and then we can discuss this one, or can't discuss it, but I'll explain it to you. All right. So question 23 talks about a city that is conducting a census every 4 years to determine the population and to obtain details such as age, address, incomes, and jobs. Due to its population of over 6 million, the city arranges to collect its census data online rather than on paper. Every resident in the city is asked to log on to a website on the census date to complete a series of questions online. Now, once again, as much as possible, they try to find situations where this has occurred and talk about or ask you questions that are relevant to what has occurred. So I just Googled the 2016 census, and if I show you the results of that, it talks about the results of the 2016 census. But if I put in here crash, we get all these. Yeah, so if I put in the 2016 census crash, you can see there's a number of websites which talk about how the census actually failed, and there was a number of theories. One was that, there were cyber attacks, deliberate attacks were blamed for the website crashing. It was the government's way of saying it crashed because there were cyber attacks on it. Well, if you understand networking and how data packets happen, and we've just seen this happen recently. Cyber attacks are data packets being sent to a particular website, and therefore you can't get a return result because of the amount of data packets that actually are being sent to it. In other words, the website was flooded with requests from data packets which were trying to retrieve information and then fill out the form. The census crashed because there was everyone in Australia was going online to actually fill out the census. It wasn't a cyber attack, it was just simply that the census couldn't cope. There were people who lost their jobs over it. Well, it was reported that they lost their jobs. Now, whether or not they lost their jobs is another thing. And of course, the government came out and tried to blame other things. In fact, they've done it just recently where, Centrelink, if we look up Centrelink, the Centrelink website at the moment is crashing because people are going to it to register that they are an individual, and maybe it's going to work. I'm not sure, but individuals are going to the Centrelink website at the moment to register because they've lost their jobs due to coronavirus, and just recently they tried to pin it on a cyber attack that the Australian government's job seekers website went down. Once again, a classic example of a crash due to data packets being flooded on the internet. Surprisingly enough, when I talk about this, it just brings to mind, we hear about things like DDoS attacks, and this is a classic example of how a DDoS attack actually works. This wasn't a DDoS attack. This was just a large volume of people I say volume because we use that term as far as data goes. A large volume of people accessing a website at once, and of course the data packets cannot be resent, and of course hence we have a crash. So that's what actually happens, right? Now, look at the first question. It says, describe the advantages to the city of conducting the census online rather than on paper. The key words, of course, is, you'll notice, it says describe, and I didn't get up my document that I was talking about as far as the key terms used in the HSC. So once again, opening this document, it says provide characteristics and features. So we had to describe the advantages of that. So, and also you'll notice a couple of things. It says advantages, so it is plural. So we need more than one advantage, and we need to describe each of those advantages and talk about what is the advantages of conducting the census online rather than on paper. Now, in responding to this question, the first thing I would tell you to do is to not write, the advantages to the city of conducting the census online rather than on paper. Don't rewrite the question. There's no point in you rewriting the question. HSC markers aren't looking for you to rewrite it. Just simply get to the points, right? So the advantages of the city conducting the census online rather than on paper, they were things like time, okay? It's going to take a lot more time to actually produce the paper in order to conduct the census. That means it's going to require more people working on this. It's going to then take a lot more time to sort all the information out. And then, of course, so that's the time one, and that's describing the advantages of that, right? Another one would be cost. Now, to describe the cost, you would talk about how it costs so much money to produce a paper-based one rather than online. Paper, there's 6 million people in this city. You have to print 6 million copies. That would cost a lot of money in ink, also in paper, and also the distribution of that paper as well would cost. And therefore, you'd need people employed to be able to do it. So you can see how you can sit down and describe the advantages. Now, the marking guide to that question says, zoom in a bit, data collected online can be more accurate. There's one, as input marks and validation procedures. Example, reasonableness check can be implemented. In addition, data collected online in digital form, less storage space. A lot of students said that. Searching and analysing process. So that you can see that this answer was done in terms of the information processes subject. So you can, and also, it goes on to talk about it's quicker. Results of the census can be available earlier. And obviously money and production costs and things like that were also taken into advantage. If you just identified an advantage, identify again, of course, is just to list the advantages. So if you said, cost, time, also sorting, searching, if you just list those ones, then you've got 1 mark. But if you outline them, a very basic describe, I would say, is an outline. You only receive 2 marks. But then, of course, if you went into detail or describe the advantages to the city conducting the census online, which is a sample answer there, then, of course, you've got 3 marks. Question B talks about explain why it is important for the website to be tested prior to its launch. This is where, when I was talking about the website where it crashes, a lot of students brought this up. And they talked about the different types of test data that would need to be used to do this. So, you would, use volume data to test the website. You would flood it with data packets to see whether or not it would cope with the 6 million people that are going to go online at the same time. You could also say that it would be live data tested as well, possibly, but not necessarily live data tested. You'd have to explain it. So if we look at the term explain, we relate cause and effect. So you'd have to say, in order for you need to do volume testing because if you don't, then the system is going to crash, the website's going to crash because there will be so much data happening at once and it needs to be able to cope with this. So therefore, you would consistently say it in terms of explaining so that you would understand that you would need to know why and or how that is going to happen. So the marking guide on this one says, explains why the website needs to be tested prior to its launch. So we look back at, did they provide cause and effect? Did they provide a why and a how? And or was it just simply you showed some understanding of why? So if you said, oh, it needs to be tested because you don't want it to crash, yeah, it does need to be tested. We know that, but yeah, and you don't need. But why don't we need it to be able to crash? And that was a very important fact. Oh, just going back on this other one as well. Advantages were also that disabled people would need to be able to use the website as well. So there was a lot of mention on students when I was marking this that talked about why you would need to conduct it online so that disabled people could actually fill out the census as well. And of course, they then went into details about how you would actually need that to done. And they also mentioned it here as well that, you know, you need to have disabled people test it to make sure that they can use it as well so that you get accurate data readings. So you can see why explains, the key term explains goes into that. If you show a little bit of understanding, that's worth 2 marks. And then if you only showed basic understanding of that, you only receive 1 mark. So this one here is an example. You can see that they talk about volume testing. So volume data, remember we have simulated live volume data that we test, and you know we really are wanting to use volume data because we want to flood the website with data packets. You can't see my hands at the moment, but they're simulating data packets, you know, flooding a website to test it. The next question is a 4-mark question which says, describe the requirements of the system in terms of storing and retrieving and analysing. Now, students didn't quite read this question very well, so I'm going to go through. The key term is describe. The requirements, all right, so it's plural, so there's more than one requirement that you have to describe in terms of this system, in terms of storing and retrieving. Now, storing and retrieving is how are you storing the data that is being entered by a person who's filling out the census. Well, if we look in terms of the population is 6 million, you would need to store this data, you'd need lots of storage space. So students went into detail about particular storage space and how big it needed to be on a server, so they also understood that it would be stored on a server. And then the process of retrieving, students needed to talk about how that data is retrieved. And that is in terms of the media that the transmission media that is used, and how are they going to get that fast? So we talk about storing and retrieving in fast processing power. So we need a high processing CPU. We also need large amounts of storage, and you can also say how it's retrieved in terms of the transmission media. So are we talking about optical fiber here to grab the information? Then in terms of analysing, this one wasn't answered very well. The process of analysing data is when you look at the data and you draw not assumptions but conclusions about what the data is saying. Now, if we look in terms of this, the 2016 census, we can get results from the Australian Bureau of Statistics about that. And here's quick stats. Median age is 38, and females 50%, male 50. People were 23 million that did the 2016 census. That is a way in which that data is analysed. Okay, so it's retrieved. And students did actually talk about, when they did answer this question, they talked about using a spreadsheet or even the key term of data mining. So if we look at the marking guide here, you can see that to get the full marks, you describes the requirements, that's plural, for the system in terms of analysing, storing and retrieving. And you can pause this video and you can read what it says, but in a nutshell, large amounts of primary and secondary storage, fast and powerful processors will be required to handle the complex manipulation of data. And then down here it talks about the analysis of the census data. So we need to look at the getting the data from maybe a database server or even a spreadsheet, and then retrieving that data and looking at what happens with that. So we need some RAM processing, we need storage space. We also may need to back up the data as well. One thing that I do remember clearly about the analysing of the data, students started talking about analysing the data, and then they'd go into processing the data. So they'd lose their way a little bit, and so then they didn't quite do the requirements for the system in terms of analysing. They did this one, which is and/or storage and retrieving. So they got 3 marks. Quite a comprehensive response, but they only got 3 marks because they didn't go into the analysing part of the data. So that's question 23 of the 2019 paper. I hope that helps a lot in terms of what a HSC marker is looking for when you respond, in terms of don't rewrite the question, just answer it and make sure that you understand these words: describe, explain, describe, and also the other parts of it is the highlighting of the plurals. And also, I mentioned it too, the context of it is talking about this system, right? So in terms of the system, it's not really talking about that, but it would be wise to actually mention the city and the population of 6 million and the reasons why these questions are being asked. So that's really important that you do look at that type of context. Hope that helps.